Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. After Sheikh Ibrahim talks, of course, any act that's going to follow is going to be possibly unworthy act. So I'm going to just call myself the light entertainment for the day. And hopefully what I'm trying to do here is facilitate a discussion between us, because I think most of you here are probably more than capable of bearing this topic, more than myself, to facilitate a conversation about the idea of the prophets and heroism. Now, I learned two things about Selwyn College last night. I don't know much about this college, but I just decided to look it up. And the interesting thing is, if you look at the coat of arms, there's a similarity between the coat of arms here and the Kingdom of Jerusalem that appeared during the Crusades. I don't know what the connection is there, but that was interesting. The second thing is that the college motto fits the topic of my lecture quite adequately. It's "Quit ye like men," which sounds a bit like, quit. But in the archaic language of the King James Bible, this means be men, right? So become as men, carry yourselves like men. In fact, I looked up the Arabic translation of the New Testament. So this is from Paul's letter to the Corinthians. I think it's the first book towards the end, after he's given them a lot of advice, and then he tells them finally to be like men. So the Arabic translation is kunu rijalan. So for those of you who know Arabic, you'll get a sense of what Paul is trying to convey here. So the full line is, watch ye, stand fast in the faith, quit ye like men, be strong, let all your things be done with charity. And I think this is actually, this is a beautiful summary of what the heroic is at heart, once we see and we discuss, not only in relation to the Islamic tradition, but in the wider sense of the term. When we look at other, not only other religious traditions, but if we go back to ancient mythologies, folklore, we find these kind of recurrent themes among all people considered to be heroes in all human societies. Now, worth bearing in mind, of course, it says be like men, rijalan. It's probably not meaning that women are excluded from this definition of what a hero is. In fact, Selwyn College, that's the third fact about Selwyn College, is that it was one of the first to allow women in 1967 to reside here. And they're just currently celebrating the first 40 years of women being here at Selwyn College. So, of course, the question we want to ask here is, what does it mean to be a man in the true sense of the term? So, of course, this isn't a gender-specific idea of being male or heroic. This is an idea of what it is to be human, in fact, in the true sense of the term. Now, the reason I'm imposing this topic upon all of you this afternoon is really to do with a childhood interest of mine going back to when I was a little boy. And my parents, you could say, brought me up on different streams, different cultures. I think Sheikh Ibrahim mentioned earlier the 5 colors of Islam. I think they added a 6th one, which is, I'm not sure what color it is, but it's the one I think that we're trying to develop here at the CMC, which is based here in Britain, inshallah. And what it is my mother, who was a convert to Islam, she was English, she would bring me up with stories of Sahaba, and she actually taught me how to read the Quran as well. So for that, I owe her my gratitude, and again, I want to bring her as the first example as a hero in my life, really. And the interesting thing is, the stories of Sahaba were what drew me, what inspired me, and still continue to inspire me throughout my life. But she also brought me up on a translation of Beowulf. Those of you who know Beowulf, the Old English epic poem. Now, so if you can imagine being raised listening to stories of Sahaba and Beowulf and trying to fit the two together, that's basically what led you to what we're discussing about today. Now, the question I want to ask is there something universal about what it is to be heroic that Islam can identify and share and appreciate in other cultures? Or is the concept of heroism that we find in arguably pagan epics like Beowulf something contrary to Islamic beliefs? And if there is something like a concept like heroism in Islam, what is it? Now, this goes back to a more recent conversation that I had with a colleague of mine about the meaning of the exemplary model of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ. Because, of course, many traditional Muslims will view him as the perfect model for mankind, someone who doesn't commit sins or mistakes even, right? He represents, in many Sufi circles, he represents sort of a perfection that is above all creation. And I said to my friend, I find this very beautiful. And of course, this is something we all want. We want to believe there's a saving grace, a savior figure. But in a way, that makes the stories of his life very difficult to identify with. I mean, if you're talking about someone who's a superhero, essentially, a superhuman, who has knowledge of things beyond the grasp of normal men, strength and abilities beyond the grasp of normal men, how do you identify with him on your day-to-day basis? I mean, how do you say, how do you basically take the kernel of heroism in that life story and apply it to your own life story, if you're someone who's far from being a hero, like myself? So once again, I have to apologize. This is a heroic topic. So in the morning, you had a heroic topic brought to you by a heroic character. What you're having here is a heroic topic brought to you by a very unheroic character. And in fact, I have to say, and if I'm honest, when I met some of you and spoke to some of you and got to know some of you, I had the very unheroic urge to actually make my excuses and convince Al-Hakim to do a second session, which I'm sure many of you would be happy to have, actually. So my apologies again. But in a way, most of us, human beings, we aren't heroes, right? We know we fall short of those expectations. So how can we identify with the life of someone who is completely pure from sin, from error, and be able to draw lessons from that life story? So I'll revisit this towards the end of the talk. Now, the question is, why reflect on heroism at all? I mean, is it part of Islamic tradition to reflect on heroes? I mean, we have the Sahaba, we have the Salaf, we have great figures from Islamic history. But the word hero isn't often used in a sense of a particular genre, right? So if I can justify this from the point of view of Islamic tradition, right, of course, what I'm going to say here is really going to fit within the genre of writing which was referred to often as the targhib or tarhib literature, right? So from the perspective of the very serious hadith scholars, there are a lot of stories about the Prophet and early prophets, pre-Islamic prophets, or legends about other saints and so on that didn't quite fit the strict criteria of hadith transmission. So you couldn't use them for things like law or principles of theology. But you could use them if you were going to use them to inspire the people to live righteously, to live virtuously, right? So targhib meaning to create inspiration, and tarhib to create a sense of fear, right? To remind people of the afterlife and so on. So in this genre of literature, we'll find people who are generally strict hadith scholars and wouldn't apply very weak hadiths or strange hadiths, would use these if it was used for the purpose of inspiring people. So essentially what it is we can basically from that perspective apply stories that don't necessarily have a very strict criteria as a means to strengthen our iman, right? It's basically looking at the lives of people and saying, this is inspirational. I'm not entirely sure if this is necessarily what happened, or this figure might not be a Muslim, but this is a story I can derive some inspiration from. So that's a justification from the perspective of Islamic tradition. And of course, when we look at the Quran too, the Quran addresses us in the mode of stories constantly, right? It says, have you heard of this story? Or in reference to the Surah Yusuf, it says, we will tell you the best of all stories that we have revealed to you. So the Quran doesn't shy away from the idea that storytelling is a very central feature of human life. And in fact, if you think about the idea of the Quran itself, or the idea of God, in fact, theologically, we're talking about God as authority in the context of fiqh, in the context of theology, of kalam, and so on. But in the deeper sense, God is also the author of our lives, right? In a sense, the Quran is recounting all these stories, but in a sense, the Quran is also telling us what's true about our life stories too, and the story of life as a whole. So it doesn't seem unjustifiable to approach the tradition, approach the stories given in the Quran and the other traditions, with a slightly looser approach to the strict hadith criteria when we apply it for law, but also when we want to apply these stories as a way to motivate ourselves to be more heroic. But there's something deeper about this that I discovered as I started thinking more about the topic. There's something about these stories that almost are transformative. So it's not just, this is a great story about a guy who lived a great life and maybe I can live up to that model. There's something that happens to you as you read these stories too, that transforms you from within. And as I'll get to the end, this is what I think, what I would consider to be something that, on one level we have the heroic, right? These are the identifiable stories where we say a courageous man or a virtuous man or a very kind, merciful man. And then we have the superheroic stories where prophets are bringing forth miracles, superhuman powers, basically, in order to demonstrate the existence of something beyond. But there's a third level happening here, which is the meta-heroic. It's a situation where when you're reading the story, you yourself are transformed through reading that story, through experiencing it. And sometimes it's not quite, the lesson in that story isn't quite the apparent one. Right? So here I might be touching upon something which is referred to in the literature as the batin level of the Quran, or the stories recounted in the Sunnah. So I want to safeguard you from any problems here, and again remind you that this is meant to be light entertainment, but we could be touching on something a bit more serious with regard the nature of the topic. Because when you reflect upon the heroic, you're not just reflecting upon something inspirational, or something that points towards the existence of something beyond everyday existence. You're reflecting on something which is true about man. And man, what is man but the centerpiece of creation here, right? So in a sense, it's really interesting when you think about the first story of the Quran. What's the first story that we come across when we read the Quran from the beginning to the end? It's the story of Adam. And the story of Adam isn't necessarily a heroic story in the sense of Adam did something great and amazing. If anything, Adam made a mistake, and we're all paying for it in some form. So God creates Adam, and the angels turn to him and say, why would you want to place upon earth something which will cause corruption and bloodshed? The angels know this, right? The Mufassirun discuss and debate about why they knew this or how they knew this. That doesn't matter. The point is they knew something. And interestingly, we are living in a time when this feature of our humanity is becoming more and more manifest. And God simply replies to him, says, Inni a'lamu ma la ta'lamun. I know what you don't. So, was it wrong for the angels to question God? And why is this the first story we're faced with in the Quran? Surely there's something about humanity which the angels know, but there's something about humanity which angels don't know. Right? And what happens next, of course, God tells the angels to prostrate to Adam, and then Adam is tempted, and then he falls, right? Eats from the forbidden tree. So, what's the point of the story? Now, I could suggest perhaps that there would have been no story at all if this didn't happen. I mean, if we thought about the way the heavens were before man was created, the angels said, "Nahnu nusabbihuna bihamdika wa nuqaddisu lak." We sing your praises and we sanctify you, right? The angels are complete beings of light. There's no story there. They are constantly circling around in adoration of God. If I were to come to you and tell you a story and say, once upon a time, there were some angels, and they sanctified God, and that's it. I mean, that's not a story. It's wonderful, it's a beautiful picture, but it's not a story. Nothing happened there. But if I said, well, then God created something, and the angels were confused, and this thing went on to be tempted and fell, and then the story of humanity, of course, as we all know. So in a way, this had to happen. In a way, if God is the greatest, and God is the greatest author, the greatest composer, surely the story has to have an element within it that sets it into motion. So in a way, man plays a role, a heroic role, but not in a very obvious way, in the sense that we can understand. It's not like man went and saved someone or something. But in a sense, he set the story into motion. And as we'll see, this is one feature of the hero in many cultures, many mythologies, many religious traditions. The hero isn't just someone who brings about salvation or a feat of strength. He is the figure that sets the story, brings it to another level, So, going back to the topic of heroism within the Islamic tradition, I think there's a lot of room for reflection here on these stories that we find in the Quran, not in the way we normally understand them. We tend to think of the story of Adam as, a way to reflect on, the fallibility of man. And that's true. I'm not saying it's not true. Then we think about, how God saved Adam from his temptation. He forgave him. That's true as well. It's a reflection of divine mercy. But there's something more going on here. There's something about the fact that God could compose such a story and had to almost bring about and set into the story into motion through an act which seemed very unheroic or seemed lesser than the virtue one would expect from a hero. So one of the famous figures, when you mention heroism today, one of the famous figures you'll hear about in the context of discussions in literature on heroism is Joseph Campbell. And many of you might be familiar with some of Joseph Campbell's work indirectly through the film series Star Wars, right? So I told you, Abdul Hakim's, I'm taking you back up the surface now with my Star Wars references. So he says that after studying different mythologies and religious stories from around the world, he actually found that there is a certain, he argues it's called a monomyth, right? It's a certain almost pattern you'll find within all these different traditions, right? The hero starts off, sometimes he's like a lost, he comes from something noble, but then he falls. And there's always, in the story, there is always an element of loss, of falling, of making a mistake. Right? And then eventually regaining it. So, in that sense, the Quran shares that pattern, so to say, with the wider, diverse range of stories we'll find in all kinds of different civilizations. By just pointing out to the first story in the Quran, which is the creation of Adam itself, right? That's the story that sets all the other stories in motion, without which all the other stories wouldn't have been able to take place. So, the question is, am I justified in looking at the Quran in the context of non-Islamic mythologies, non-Islamic religious traditions? Now, again, I'm not a faqih, so I'm not going to make an apology for this from the perspective of a learned Muslim authority, which I'm not at all. I'm simply a guy who liked stories as a kid, and I'm trying to explore this possibilities we can find beyond the Islamic tradition. And I think Sheikh Hakim pointed out this need, actually, in finding deeper resources within our local traditions. Now, I told you that I was brought up in a few more shades of beyond the 5 colors that Sheikh Hakim mentioned. I think in some ways we all are. I mean, most of you I've spoken to speak English. You've probably lived here longer than I have. I came here when I was 18, hence the accent. How often do we contemplate on the resources of the local culture, the stories, the myths, the folklore, the legends of the people who live around here? Some of us, of course, have relatives from this tradition. At the moment, Christians are celebrating Easter. Right? Today, I think it's referred to as Black Saturday. It's a day where Jesus is, after he was crucified, he's in the tomb, and then he goes into hell. He goes into the underworld, where he brings out the souls of people who were around before him. So it's a very important day for Christians. Now, of course, as Muslims, generally, the consensus is Jesus was not crucified on the cross. Right? So one could say, well, what's the point of studying this story? What's the point of appreciating it? Well, firstly, we live here, so I want to understand what's going on with Easter. I mean, I have friends who are, it's a very important time of the year. But I think one can even appreciate it. So, one can even appreciate the story as a story itself. One doesn't necessarily have to say, okay, well, the Easter, it kind of conflicts, the Easter story conflicts with the idea that Jesus was not crucified, which the Quran says, it appeared to them, but he wasn't crucified, he wasn't killed. But what's the point of the story? Now, another important figure that gets brought up when we talk about heroism is Thomas Carlyle. Some of you seem to have been familiar with this when I mentioned the topic. He wrote a really interesting book in the mid-19th century called On Heroes, Hero Worship, and Heroism. And many Muslims actually are familiar with this book because the second chapter of the book he explores the theme of heroism through the different ages and through different themes. So the first one is the hero as a god, basically, where he looks mainly at Scandinavian mythology. He looks at stories of Odin and other gods of the Norse tradition. And then the second one is called the hero as a prophet, where, in fact, the main subject of this chapter is Muhammad, peace be upon him. So many Muslims have found this book quite interesting because here we have a 19th century gentleman who's, and things he says in there about the Prophet Muhammad are quite interesting. As some scholars have, of course, said, people have tended to exaggerate the amount of praise he heaps on Muhammad in this chapter. But I think if you read closely, of course, he is careful and guarded about the degree to which he would say, okay, well, Muhammad was a real prophet. But if you read between the lines, he's basically pointing to his own acceptance of this belief. And not only that, he actually says in one place that what makes Muhammad stand out among all heroes is the degree of sincerity he has. So, okay, that's something that many Muslim commentators have already pointed out about this book. Now, what's interesting about Carlyle's work on heroes is that it basically initiates a conversation happening among Christians at the time, 19th century, with earlier mythologies, such as the Norse folklore, stories of Odin and so on, which I mentioned, where they are reappreciated, not as just superstitious tales, or he points out elsewhere as allegories of moral truths, but as reflecting something deeper. And the point he makes is that you can't just simply have, once you dismiss the idea that they're just simply superstitious tales, that they have some basis, because human beings, they don't just take stories on board for no reason. They're attracted to something within the stories that they believe in. So, because there's a certain kernel of truth in them. And it's not simply that they are an allegorical representation of some moral truths that they might hold. Because to get to that point to begin with, where the story is going to be told, there has to be some element of real, authentic faith. So throughout the work, Carlyle actually points out to the fact that human beings don't just simply believe without some feeling or sense that there is a kernel of truth in the story, even if the story itself has accumulated and added components which have, over the years evolved from superstitious beliefs and so on. So going back to Easter, one could say as a Muslim, this story might contradict the theological principles of Islam. Of course, we do not participate in the celebrations and so on in the same way as a Christian would. However, what is the point of this story? Why does Jesus die and then goes down into the underworld? What does Jesus represent for Christians? He represents the grace of God, which as Muslims, of course, we accept as well. We know that whatever our actions, we might try to live up to those standards, we might try to live heroic lives, but ultimately the final say in what our fate in this life and the next world is going to ultimately be coming from God. Right? We had a short moment, of course, in Islamic history when Mu'tazilite theology advocated the idea that human actions were distinct from the power of God. We actually autonomously, distinctively decide in a way that God himself can't control. But of course, generally speaking, the Sunni theological tradition has accepted that God has predetermined our actions. Right? We acquire our actions through kasb. So this seems to point to the idea that we do have to strive for the greater good and to improve our lives, but at the same time, the ultimate decider in our fate has to be the divine. And we might disagree with the Christians about the nature of Jesus, but we do agree that he is the Word of God. So therefore, the kernel of the story, even though it might not have happened in this way, and the significance of Jesus might be exaggerated in the Christian tradition, we do accept that what they are currently celebrating today in the churches around the world is the idea that human beings are weak and fallible and are in need of divine grace. Right? This is the superheroic aspect of the three heroic dimensions I mentioned earlier. Right? The fact that we accept that we strive and we strive and we strive, but at some point we're going to have to get help from outside, from elsewhere. There is just that final bit that there's no chance we can complete that destination without support. So, in a sense, what I'm saying is, I'm not saying that we need to now say, okay, well, maybe the Christians are onto something. They're right completely about their doctrine and so on. What I'm trying to say is, it's important for us to understand what's going on around us and the significance of this story, because in some sense, we speak that language and we live in that culture, so therefore we do share a common bond, a common experience, in a sense, of life, which is derived from this language that we share with these people. And somewhere at the roots of what we experience through this language, through living in this environment, there is that Christian dimension. And there is something true about that story, which we can approach once we have understood the theological problems that it might raise for our doctrine. There's something about the story which we can appreciate. At the very least, to be able to say, I understand, I sympathize with why people are celebrating this at the moment. Now, this might be a very extreme example, but the second example I can give you is, in 2 weeks' time, the Jewish community will be celebrating Passover. And in a way, there are less theological problems with this practice, because the Quran does say, it tells the Bani Israel to remember God when He saved them, right? Ya Bani Israel, adhkuru ni'mati allati an'amtu alaykum. So when Jews gather around a table and they remember this episode when Musa came in and saved them, great act. Again, this couldn't have happened without supernatural help. Musa was, in fact, the Quran tells us, Musa was afraid to go to the Pharaoh. He wouldn't have done it. God had to give him those miracles. God had to send him with Harun before he could do it. So in a sense, Musa showed some reluctance as a hero, some lack of confidence in the ability to do it. So that story too represents, the kernel of that story really represents the necessity of divine grace. Now these are more immediate contexts that we can refer to because, of course, the Quran talks about them. But what happens when we're faced with a story in a mythology which is unrecognizable, something pagan, for example? Are we supposed to just sort of dissolve it all? You say, well, okay, this was written before the English, for example. I mean, the tales that they told Norse mythology or Anglo-Saxon mythology, are we supposed to kind of completely say, there's no point understanding any of this? This has nothing to do with us. There are expressions in English that go back to Christian practices, but also have a more ancient pre-Christian origin that you can't quite understand and appreciate until you actually get to the stories. And we go back to the idea that we are, in a way, inevitably tied to our local context, but at the same time, we are faced with this tiger modernity, which Ibraheem referred to, and in a situation where we are lacking those deep resources, right? I mean, we might have it through study of Arabic or the Quran and so on. In fact, I often get this from people. I meet people and they tell me, I really want to study Arabic. I want to be able to access those resources. And that's a very good endeavor. But there are resources around us within the stories that are told by the people, by the culture, and celebrated in rituals and festivals, in languages that we can actually access and understand. This is, in fact, what happened in Java, and still happens today when you see people reenacting the stories from the Mahabharata, from the Ramayana. They're not doing it because it's a remnant of Hindu belief and practice. They're doing it because there's an understanding that these are deep resources that you can't just get rid of once the final revelation of Islam has appeared. what happens is Revelation appears and it sheds a new light on those old stories. It retells the stories. It tells you what truly means to be heroic. And that's the third level of heroism I referred to, which is the meta-heroic level. So when Islam appeared in places like Java, and you get this in the stories of the 9 saints, you know, a lot of discussions among them, in fact, about how they need to comport themselves. And Sheikh Ibrahim referred to this earlier. Of course, they got rid of their Islamic names, and they even adopted new forms of dress. And this wasn't just a da'wah method. This was an understanding that they were in new soil. They were in a new ocean. They had to move and breathe in the way that was relevant to that context. And it wasn't a matter of emptying out the water from that ocean and then replacing it with a new one. It was actually by saying to people, well, you know this story you have here, well, this is exactly what the Quran says when this verse is mentioned. Or this is how the story of Muhammad sheds new light on this story in the Mahabharata. So I've gone a long way to basically bring about a very simple point, really. That in a way we have to revisit the tales, not only of the Quran, but also of the stories, the folk tales, the mythologies around us, in order to, in a way, avoid the mistake of kufr ni'mah, of dismissing the bounty and benefit of the things that are there before our very eyes. Now, let me proceed to a discussion of some of the prophets in the Quran. And again, I said I really want to bring us to discuss the meaningfulness of the whole topic of heroism in the Islamic context, but also beyond. But I wanted to focus on a few. And I tried to think about what were the most heroic stories in the Quran. And of course, we have the notable reference to the prophets of the Ulul Azm, right? The people of great perseverance. And there are differences of opinion, of course, about who these prophets were, and some people have argued that all the prophets, in fact, had to face great challenges from within their community, and therefore they are all Ulul Azm. And there are prophets that aren't necessarily mentioned as the Ulul Azm, but really could earn a place in this if this was a ranking of prophets distinct from other prophets. For example, Prophet Ayub. But I felt that Ayub isn't always referred to in this context because, in a way, Ayub was tested with personal hardship. He didn't have a message necessarily to people. What happened was God tested him with sickness and loss of the family. But what seems to draw out the usual prophets that are thought of as Ulul Azm is the fact that they're given a mission and they have to put up with all kinds of challenges in order to bring about the fulfillment of that mission. So there are some traditions that exclude Yunus as well and Adam because, of course, in their stories they have showed mistakes or lack of commitment. So Adam didn't really have a people to bring a message to. He was there. He was the only human being. Yunus almost gave up, right? And we know the story where he ends up in the belly of the whale. So the very first figure, really, that one could say there is some level of consensus on is Nuh, right? That great builder of the ark. And in a way, Nuh is the classic exemplar of the prophet who is sent with a mission and then is challenged by his people. Because his great longevity, right? The Quran says he lived 950 years with his people. 950 years, and I think the Quran also says that, Inni da'awtu qawmi laylan wa nahara. I was calling upon my people day and night. So 950 years, day and night, 24/7, just with the mission. And out of that, how many people followed him in the end? A very small select few. And in fact, the Quran tells him that God has destined most of these people to not accept his message. So in some ways, this makes this incredibly difficult. I mean, if you are told to bring about a message in which only a few are going to receive, and then for 950 years, I mean, Noah was, according to the stories, he had to put up with social rejection, mockery. And I would say the hardest part of Noah's mission, perhaps, is at the very end, when he gets onto the ship, the ark, and he's suddenly confronted with the fact that his family aren't going to be there with him, right? And he even asks God about this. He says, well, what about my family? And there's this discussion he has with his son. His son says, I'm going to find a higher place. So in some ways, the story of Noah is actually incredibly heroic in the sense that he's given such a great mission and accomplishing what from many of us would seem like very little, really, just a few people and animals. And then also faced with the fact that with all that hard work, his own family couldn't be saved. There's something incredibly tragic about the story of Noah, in fact. Like, I don't know, I mean, all of you have family members. If you knew that you had a key to their salvation, but somehow they weren't going to get it, but other people were. I mean, this. So I think Noah is exceptionally heroic in the fact that he has to put up with this. He accepts this stoically. I mean, of course, the Quran doesn't give us the details about how he felt, but one can imagine, one can identify, one can sympathize with this. What's interesting about the story of Noah is that it also immediately engages us with the pagan context of heroism, particularly if you take in the stories from the Qisas al-Anbiya that are surrounding it. So not just the Quran, but you go to work like Ibn Kathir, the kind of Israeliyat and hadith that are narrated surrounding the story. Because, and this again, this is interesting, because reading this together with Carlyle, I came across the idea that, I mean, basically Carlyle makes the argument that pagans are not what we think them to be. They're not just simple polytheists with superstitious beliefs. They actually, the kernel of paganism goes back to a worldview that is intensely divine. That basically pagans see God in everything, and that's why they worship trees and rocks and so on. And we see this story echoed in the Quranic tales as well, when they tell us about how idols came into being. So in the story of Noah, according to Ibn Kathir, what happens is that there were great heroes in the times before Noah, and over time, these great heroes became revered and worshipped to the exclusion of God. So the Quran refers to them by name, in fact, Wad, Suwa', Yaghuth, Ya'uq, Nasr. Right, it's one of those rare moments where we're actually confronted with the details, details that even archaeology today would tell us or confirm. So these were great heroes. They represented things like courage and manliness and chivalry. And eventually they became idolized. So in the very first story, the very first properly heroic story of the Quran, we already are warned with the consequences of extreme hero worship. So this fits together with Noah's own experience with his son. Because when he asks God, why isn't my son going to be saved along these people? God says, Innahu min amalin khayru salihin, right? And what's interesting here, I mean, symbolically, of course, our children are the greatest consequences of our actions. They really, I mean, when I look at my young son and I see him do something wrong or bad, I worry because that's coming from me. Where else is he getting it from? So the child represents symbolically and essentially represents where your actions are going to go. And in a way, God replies to Noah in this way because he's saying he's not the consequence of your action. This is something else going on here. Or one could interpret it differently and say it was also a warning to Noah, right? Noah, of course, was a prophet and he was rightly guided, but perhaps he was being warned not to think that his actions were what would eventually save these people. So in a sense, it's a safeguard, right? We want to emphasize the heroic, but we don't want to go too far. We want to emphasize the virtuous, but there is a danger of when we start to think, hey, my virtuous actions are the ones that are going to get me out of this situation, that are going to save me. If even the consequences of our children's actions can't be safeguarded, how can we really know where our actions are going to lead us to? And in this sense, what is heroic about many of the prophet heroes of the Quran is that they are often dealing with lack of knowledge and ambiguity, although of course they receive revelation and direct guidance from God and protection, isma from sin, they're often in a situation where they don't really know completely what's going on. We see this in the story of Musa, particularly. If you get to the very middle of the Quran, what's interesting is it's the story of Musa and this mysterious figure, which is often identified with Khidr, right? Musa, according to the surrounding traditions, Musa tells the people of Israel, he stands in front, he says, I don't know if there's anyone who knows God more than I do. And God basically reveals to him and says, no, you're wrong. And then Musa, of course, he's humbled and he really wants to find out who else knows God better than he does. And this leads to the story where he encounters this mysterious figure. And what happens in the story is interesting because, of course, you all know the story quite well, I'm sure, right? Musa is shown 3 different actions by this guy, Khidr, perhaps, and they don't make any sense. He destroys the boats of the fishermen that help them cross the sea, then he kills a young child, then he hides some treasure while they were both being invited to a gathering, a festival. None of these actions make any sense on the social, moral realm. And in the end, of course, this figure explains that there's a deeper underlying story there. But Musa doesn't leave with the now extra supernatural knowledge of the consequences of actions and therefore a new Sharia which will say, okay, now I know what's going to happen, so I know that maybe killing this person is actually going to save. Maybe killing this boy means that there won't be a Hitler that will rise up in the world. No, Musa goes back to reality, the reality that we all inhabit where we don't know the consequences of our actions. And this goes back to the kind of discussion I had with this colleague about the degree to which prophets are heroic in the sense that they're something identifiable through their inability to cope, to understand the vast, infinite complications of the universe. And I think Musa in many cases echoes this. I mean, maybe we just live in an age of much doubt and uncertainty, but Musa constantly is questioning God. He's constantly asking. There's something a bit brazen about the way Musa does this. Now, is this unheroic? As I mentioned earlier, when God sent Musa to the Pharaoh, he expressed doubt as well. He says, I'm not going to be able to go there. He'll kill me. Or quite frequently, he expresses doubt about whether his people are actually going to listen to him. So, is Musa a hero in that sense of the term? The other figure I haven't mentioned, I'll briefly do this before we go to the further discussion, is Ibrahim. Ibrahim is an interesting character because, in a sense, we don't get much of a story with Noah and the prophets that followed him until Ibrahim. There is really just a few stories, a few references to what happened when they were sent and then God punished the people and so on. But with Ibrahim, we get multiple stories in the Quran throughout. And we get a sense of what happened to Ibrahim from the beginning when he was young and then all the way to the point at which he is the father of these 2 great nations. And what I found interesting about Ibrahim is that the story with the idols, where he breaks all the idols and then he puts the axe on one of the idols. And when they come back, they say, well, who did this? And then he says, that idol did it. That is, firstly, it really resonates with a type of heroic figure you'll find in many of these traditions, which is a trickster hero. So heroes aren't just strong, mighty people or people with magical, supernatural powers behind them. Heroes can often be people who use cunning and intelligence in order to defeat their opponents. And here we see Ibrahim doing exactly that, using a wise, cunning strategy to point out the absurdities of polytheism. But there's more to it than that with Ibrahim. Ibrahim, too, of course, shows us great acts of courage when he was sent into the fire. But he does express doubt as well, like Musa, right? There's a point when he is asked where he sees, the dream, telling him to sacrifice his son, and he seems reluctant, of course. We need Ismail to come in and confirm to him and say, do what's right. What's interesting about this story, and Kierkegaard, the 19th century Danish philosopher, was very interested in this story. He found it to be one of the most inspiring stories of all time, really, is that it's, again, a hero is not put through something very great like an army or a dragon. He's put to face something which is very basic and, happens to everyone, really, the death of a loved one. Except in this situation, he's actually told to do it himself. So there are multiple things here which are a challenge, right? First, the death of a loved one. Secondly, you're told to kill an innocent soul. And thirdly, to be confronted with the fact that the God, that represents the higher truth for you is telling you to do something that completely doesn't make sense in your moral range. So the fact that he went ahead and did this is heroic in a certain sense. But in another way, and this is what Kierkegaard explores, if we interpret the story simply as a man who just takes a leap of faith and just accepts what God has told him to do, maybe we're losing something from the story. We're losing a certain sense. What is the point of the story? And that's the question I'm going to leave to you. Is it just to reaffirm a prophet's commitment to God, or is there something more heroic about it? And finally, there's two more figures, I think, in the Ulul Azm that I haven't mentioned. Isa. With Isa, it's difficult to say, because Isa was born pure. He's a word of God. In a sense, I think the most heroic figure in the story of Isa is really Maryam, because she is bearing this. And Isa comes with these incredible supernatural acts. So Isa, for me, represents really the superheroic dimension of the Quran, right? It represents grace. So in that sense, in fact, even though we disagree in our creed with the Christian interpretation of the events of the crucifixion and so on, fundamentally, the point is the same. Isa is sent as a kind of pure form of grace. It's pointed to as the fact that there is a power beyond which we need, right? It would be hubristic to think that we can rely on our own heroic acts to get to the final destination. Ultimately, we do need that final act of grace. And finally, we come to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, because with Muhammad, of course, we have all the dimensions of heroism in the stories, in the hadiths. We have the simple heroic acts, of course, acts of courage and bravery and charity and so on. We have the superheroic, of course, with the miracles, although interestingly, what I found quite significant about the miraculous stories attributed to Muhammad is that he never uses them in a way to force or punish people for the consequences of rejecting him. And in fact, for me, the story that resonated the most on reflection on Muhammad's life is that story in Taif when he's sent to preach to the people there and they stone him. And then Gabriel comes to him and says, well, I can throw a mountain on Taif. Right? He would do that. But Muhammad says no. So in a way, what was heroic about this story is the fact that Muhammad does not use his supernatural powers. He does not use an act of strength. He, in fact, just puts up with this. But here, there are other parts of the accounts of Muhammad's life that are more difficult to resolve, of course. We get to picture Muhammad where he is, of course, almost near to perfection, right? And this becomes more elaborated in the later Sufi interpretations of Muhammad's life, which I won't go into too much. But then there are some stories which show that he was fallible. He would make a mistake. Now, and going back to this discussion I had with my friend, and this is something I want you to discuss, and perhaps someone might have a better solution to this problem. I felt that we have to have, of course, Muhammad being the final prophet, the seal of all prophets, is required to represent the highest peaks of human possibility. In a sense, he has to be the superhero of all superheroes. If Isa is almost superhuman, right? He's in perfection, then Muhammad has to rise above that. But in a way, Muhammad has to be the model for the final community, for humanity as a whole. The other prophets were sent to various communities around the world. They spoke to them in their own idioms. The message of Islam has to be able to be flexible and accessible, accessible to the whole range of human types and personalities. And how can he do that if he does not make mistakes, if he does not commit errors? Now, one resolution to this was what led to the idea of a meta-hero, is that a meta-hero, and this maybe Khidr and the story of Musa can also be thought of as a meta-hero, commits certain actions that seem wrong or error or with error, but as a way to point towards a greater truth. Muhammad could have led a perfect life, no errors, no mistakes, but perhaps he deliberately committed the errors. I mean, the most famous one is the story in Surah Abasa, where he's approached by a blind man while he's talking to some important people in the Quraysh, and he turns away. And the Quran tells him off. Abasa wa tawalla, right? It points to this incident. Now, did the Prophet Muhammad knowingly turn away? If he is possessing of a more than average amount of human knowledge about grace and virtue, then what were the reasons behind this act? Now, one could simply say, well, he made an error of judgment. It wasn't a sin, of course. It was a form of ijtihad, right? He felt, this guy was more important. I'll talk to him. I'll ignore the blind person for now. Or was he committing an error to point to us what one should do when one commits such a mistake? I've found in one text that I have studied a reference to Muhammad as the greatest of all malamatis. If some of you might be familiar with the Sufi tradition, you will have heard that the malamatis were people who covered their saintly realities around them. They hid the fact that they were superhuman heroes, essentially, and tried to present an image of normal people, right? In fact, in the later tradition, some of them, the malamatis are associated with people who in fact behave very strangely and apparently do not follow the Sharia. Now, could it be that the greatest of all heroes, in a sense, had to restrict the extent of his greatness in order to be able to provide a better model, a more accessible message for mankind? And this is where perhaps these problems can be resolved. Now, just to sum up simply, the conclusions, I guess, if I were to outline the three levels of heroism, the heroic that we find in the stories of the prophets are generally the heroism of mission, right? The fact that they're given a heavy word, qawlan thaqila, and that they're faced with great odds against them and the rejection of their people. And in some ways, of course, this points to the importance of going beyond social, familial ties for the sake of truth. Their heroism is a heroism of sincerity. And this is something Thomas Carlyle points out with regard to Muhammad, but it's true of all the prophets mentioned in the Quran, really. The second type of heroism one finds is, in fact, the idea of the hero pioneer. They are not just models of human virtue, but in fact are the people that initiate the very foundation of human culture and society. Adam, of course, is the father of all mankind, but Ibrahim is the father of proper Abrahamic monotheism, and in fact rebuilt the city of Mecca, and then he built the temple in Jerusalem. So they have similar features to other heroic figures we find in mythology, where the heroes are not just great men, but also people who are the foundation of important things like the sciences. In fact, the prophet Idris, which isn't really referred much in the Quran, is often associated with the idea of the first development of the sciences, of agriculture, and so on. And then the third level of heroism we find is the one that's obvious, the idea of being a model of exemplary human behavior. And of course, here the courage, the kind of valor one would associate with heroes in pagan or aristocratic context is balanced out with that soft touch of kindness and charity. And Ibrahim really, as a founder of this tradition, represents this with his act of kindness and generosity towards his guests. When the two angels come, he tries to feed them, right? But also by sacrificing his own son. That's an extreme act of self-sacrifice that is represented here in a heroic form that we can all identify with. We might not all live up to it, but it's a level that we can conceivably, realistically aspire to. Then we have the superheroic level, where these prophets are miracle workers and saviors. Now, I can pass over this because this is pretty obvious. They come out of a realm beyond human abilities and point towards the existence of something greater, something more infinite. And finally, the meta-heroic dimension, which is something, it's under construction, so forgive me if it's been a bit vague. But the point is that prophets challenge the popular notion of heroism itself, as is normally found in human society. And one can say this recurs in even religious or Abrahamic societies too. Right? This pride that one feels in, all right, these were the great warriors, this is a great warrior, or this is a great man. In some ways, the heroism associated with the prophet subverts this. And Noah, of course, the story of how his people ended up making idols out of the heroes that they had in the past, addresses this problem directly. And in fact, according to some of the traditions, Noah's final testimony, final will, advice to his followers was to beware of the sin of pride. So in a sense, true heroes must point to something beyond themselves ultimately. And if we can understand maybe, in some ways, an Islamic interpretation of the Christian emphasis on the crucifixion, then one has to say, we don't agree that this happened, but we can appreciate the point of that story is to say the ultimate sacrifice one can make for your people is by sacrificing yourself, right? But in general, to go back to the Islamic interpretation of these events, it seems that the self-sacrifice isn't necessarily a literal one, a bodily one. It's more the sacrifice, if we accept the meta-heroic level, it's a sacrifice of one's own image, so to say. If Isa and Khidr and Muhammad were probably capable of greater feats than they could, but restrained themselves in order to become more approachable exemplars from humanity, then in a sense, this is the ultimate self-sacrifice of all, right? They basically live lives completely in accordance and bound by the requirements and needs of their people, and not only the people living in their direct time, but the later followers of their community. And in fact, with Muhammad, this is where we get the idea of the Sunnah, right? Every single action he performed was recorded because there was a deep inherent meaning associated there, not only to do with Islamic legal practice or ritual, but also greater truths embodied in those very practices themselves. So ultimately, the two pillars of heroism, or the prophetic heroism, are what's referred to in the Surah Al-Asr. By time, verily humanity is in loss, except for those who believe, carry out deeds of rectification, and are a testament to one another of truth, is the first pillar, and are a testament to one another of patience, of the second. So truth and patience are the two pillars upon which the entire foundation of the heroic and the virtuous in the prophetic ideal of Islam rest upon. Apologies for the limitations and my very own unheroic and weak approach to this topic, but I hope you can probably contribute and strengthen this course in the discussion. Thank you.